Of course, as you could tell, and if you read the article in the paper and the title, it's named The Magnificence of the Coastal Bend and How a Louisiana Landlubber Learned to Love It, or Desperately Seeking a Seawall. Originally, I have to tell you this, to be very perfectly honest, and here you all are. You live here by choice, or you've already purchased, or you're staying in a condominium over the winter, or you are all here by choice. I didn't want to come. This was in the mid-'60s. We were first married, and all of a sudden, I was told we were going to move to the Coastal Bend. I wasn't used to this. I had grown up, and if you're familiar at all with North Louisiana or East Texas, they have trees. And trees. They did not have open skies. I wasn't used at all to longhorn bulls. And the whole idea of the beach and the sand and the rolling waves, it was just so unfamiliar. But the longer I was here, the more and more I became enraptured by the warmth and the welcome of the people here in the Coastal Bend. And also I became very interested in the history of the area. I had taught U.S. history for the longest time, and of course I had included the fact about the Mexican War and how the United States and Mexico went to war in the 1840s. What I did not know was that in order to precipitate the war, the president had sent almost 3,000 members of the United States Army to the Coastal Bend, to Corpus Christi Bay, along the idea that this is where Mexico considered the boundary of northern Mexico, and therefore Mexico would attack the troops and bring us into war. We could defeat Mexico and take over California and all of that. That was kind of the plan. It didn't work, but so many of the troops were stationed in this area, and they did a lot of reconnoitering up and down the islands and did a lot of exploration all the way up into Matagorda Bay. I also found out, and again understand, I was raised in North Louisiana during the 40s and the 50s and the 60s, big on Confederacy, you know. Well, I can't tell you what some of the things they said, but like the South will rise again, that sort of thing. I had no idea that Texas was even involved in the Civil War, much less that the whole Union, not the whole Union, but the Navy and the Army of the Union invaded Texas all the way up our barrier isles. And I also didn't realize that there was a very interesting battle that was fought in Corpus Christi Bay next to the city, the town of Corpus Christi. And nobody ever, well, both sides claimed that they won it. It was sort of a draw, but it was here. But the other thing that really got to me, and this is where it's going to get pretty personal, when I was a kid, I got to see that movie, Zapata, that had Marlon Brando in it and Anthony Quinn. I don't even know if y'all are familiar with it. It's a wonderful film. It stayed with me forever. I dreamed about it. It wasn't until I had been in this area for the longest time that I found out a lot of my friends were the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of people who had fled that very important Mexican Revolution that the movie Zapata and that Pancho Villa were involved in 1910. So I'm already finding out there's an awful lot of history in this area. But it wasn't until I was sitting in the back of my geography room in the mid-'90s, and I was listening to one of my students give a paper, and her topic was the horrible hurricane that hit Galveston in 1900. And back then, we weren't talking about hurricanes as much as, of course, we do now. But I had heard a little bit about it, but she was extremely graphic and was giving a lot of good information. But what really made me sit up and take notice was that what she talked about what happened after the hurricane, and that's when the people of Galveston raised their front about 10 to 20 feet and built a seawall. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, that was smart. That was a good thing to do. And I'm thinking at the time, Corpus Christi has a seawall, and it's a lot prettier. We must have built ours right after Galveston did hers. And then I started investigating, and I found out that it wasn't until over 40 years after the Galveston hurricane that Corpus Christi had built its seawall. And I'm sitting there thinking, how come? How could that have possibly happened? And so then I started really delving into the coastal bend and finding out as many answers as I could as to sort of this mystery. And the first thing I ended up doing was going way back beyond the Jurassic period into what was called the Miocene period to kind of understand how this whole formation came to be. And I realized that, of course, there was this tremendous period when the continent we're on now was covered with seas, with great oceans. And then a few 100,000 years later, in the Pliocene period, they became ice. And then about 20,000 years ago, everything started heating up, and the ice caps began to melt, and the trickles started coming down, and they began turning into creeks and rivulets, and huge rivers began crushing down through these big boulders. And this went on for centuries and centuries, and they were pulling down and washing down and pulling down with them granite and gravel and bits of sand and all kinds of stuff, and rushing out through what became the coastal bend into the Gulf of Mexico and running right smack dab into countercurrents that were in the Gulf, where all of a sudden all that sand and particles began to drop and drop and drop in the same areas, century after century, and dropping finally until about the time Hammurabi was building his laws in cuneiform, Corpus Christi had its whole string of barrier islands. So I'm thinking, wow, that was pretty cool. And then I found out that the growth didn't stop there, that even today, those islands are still, in a sense, being victimized by the ocean currents. That during winter months, ocean currents flow from the north, and they're bringing in basalt and granite and that sort of thing from the hill country. And then in the summer months, the oceans are coming up from the south, and they are bringing in bits of gravel and dirt and all sorts of things from the Mexican coast, and they are dropping them again onto the islands. And they are growing and becoming more and more interesting, and you're delving with deltas and all sorts of things. And finally, it became very, very apparent to me that each of these islands is sort of a geologic time capsule, that there's all kinds of dirt and pieces of granite that have been here for centuries. And not only that, I also realized that the islands were also in a period of movement. And what that meant was that over time, Mustang Island was gradually kind of moving backwards, and St. Joseph Island was moving forwards, and that this had been going on for centuries and centuries, along with the buildups and along with the deposits. And this was, of course, caused by the ocean currents. But it was kind of a problem. In fact, the Army sent out Colonel O.H. Ernst in the Army Corps of Engineers in 1887 to try to find out what the heck is going on, and he reported, the southerly shore, that is of Mustang Island, is constantly being eroded, and the northerly shore, that of San Jose, is advancing by accretion at about 260 feet per year. That's 2/3 of the length of a football field a year. But not only were the islands gradually moving, the passageway between them, the Aransas Pass, was also changing. And he said in the Aransas Pass, the deepest part of the Aransas Pass was 9 feet deep in 1852, 7.5 feet deep in 1868, and 7 feet in 1878, which means it wasn't just the islands that were moving, it was a passageway between them that was moving. So all of this was going on because of the ocean currents, and of course, the air currents played a big part. The wind was blowing particles, just like the ocean had done, and they were dropping down onto the surface of the islands in hillocks and dunes, encasing inlets. The larger dunes sloped into grass-strewn mud banks that these eased down into marshes and flats and eventually extended into quiet lagoons, and there we have the Laguna Madre. And it wasn't just the way that the islands were being formed by the air and the wind currents, they were also dropping seeds. And soon vegetation of profound variety began to emerge on these islands. Blue-green algae mats, Senescilla, salt marsh, cordgrass, cattails, and those magnificent morning glory vines. And if you're the ones that like to walk on the beach right before dawn and just to see the sun come up from the east, if you look behind you, their morning glory vines on the backs of those dunes are just starting to bloom, and they're beautiful. But it wasn't just seeds and vegetation that were populating the islands. Animals were there: kangaroo rats, rice rats, gophers, ground squirrels, slider turtles, ribbon snakes and rails, skinks, crabs and sea turtles, gulls, terns, egrets, and great blue heron. They were all on these islands. And below them, there was other forms of life, the marine life, nurturing in the grasses and the waters of the lagoons' estuaries were snails, clams, oysters, shrimp, whelks, black drum, and redfish. And so all of these are coming together in this unique curve of the coast, a combination of landforms, water bodies, wind currents, tidal movements, and sea life unlike any other area in the whole United States I had ever heard about or studied. And I began to realize how fantastic it was. But still didn't answer my question about the seawall. And I realized that had to do with the other groups of beings that were populating the islands, and those were humans. And the first set that kind of came to settle, not to just be here for a while and then leave, came around 800 before the Common Era and evolved into the groups we call the Karankawas. And they were drawn by the preponderance of black drum and spotted sea trout. And you also know that once they had gotten used to being able to cast nets here and to catch those, they had to be curious about those landforms out. So eventually, they hollowed out oaks and made fluid-resistant water vehicles, which they finally first poled themselves across the lagoons to the backsides of the islands and then began to paddle. And they sloshed ashore onto the mud flats where they found food and were able to survive. And then decades and at least a couple of centuries later, other people came, and some of the most fascinating people began to survive also on the barrier islands. One was Patrick Dunn, who was able to raise cattle on Padre Island. No one else did this. Richard King did it way down, along the southern part. Mifflin Kennedy did a little bit closer. But Patrick Dunn raised cattle on the Padre Island because he knew two things. He had studied it. He knew that there were certain grasses there that would be, beneficial for the cattle, and he knew how to find fresh water. And I thought that was just fascinating. By the way, if y'all know Greg Smith, he's one of the descendants of Pat Dunn. But other people came too, and one of the most fascinating to me have been the members of the Mercer family. And they had come all the way from England and ended up in Ohio, and then they ended up on Mobile, and then they were on Mustang Island. And it was from the Mercers that the first dynasty, in a sense, of maritime pilots developed. And maritime pilots are some of the most unique people in the world. Even the Supreme Court has commented and actually defined maritime pilots. The Supreme Court said they have an independence wholly incompatible with general obligations. No one can tell them how to perform their duties. Even now, they are free to act upon their own best judgment. And if you understand that their original job was to guide vessels through this ever-changing Aransas Pass, you know that they really are very, very unique. And they're, of course, still doing it. And so along with that, of course, I began to see other ways in which humans were adapting to these islands. They began to develop a little bit more serviceable vessels like sloops, and then the steam engines came in and we had paddle boats in this area. And then we had river boats and steamboats. And at the same time, the people in the coastal bend were beginning to develop forms of communication that went with sailing. And if you remember way back when the Chinese were doing a lot of their exploring way back, and then the Spanish were doing a lot of it, and the Portuguese, if you went on one of those caravels, you may be gone forever and nobody would know what had happened. Or you would kind of come and go back, and 20 years later, but there was no communication. And over the years, the maritime nations like England began to develop ways of communicating, which included flag signals. And this is something the Port Aransas pilots, the Aransas Pass pilots, also learned, was how to communicate from ship to ship with flags and from ship to shore. And then, of course, thank goodness, telegraphs came along, and that made things a heck of a lot easier. But one of the things that really made me enthusiastic was how humans use technique to finally immobilize the pass which was constantly moving, the passageway, which was constantly varying in depth. And I'm doing a very unengineering here, so I know it's not, technically, but basically they learned how to pile rock upon rock and finally immobilize San Jose Island and Mustang Island, and then created the two beautiful jetties that we have, and that's North Jetty, as you know, and it's just gorgeous. So, all right, now I've got, people here, and they're learning how to deal with the islands. I still haven't found the seawall. And I began to realize that if there was going to be any kind of seawall, there had to be a group of people that wanted it, and there had to be certain urban areas. So by this time, and I'm talking here about 1910, there were 4 major urban areas that were here on the coastal bend. And one of the earliest, of course, was Corpus Christi. And then Rockport came along, and that had been popular at first for its hide and tallow factories, but it had maintained itself. Then the town of Aransas Pass built itself across from the Aransas Pass. It built itself on the coastline, but it was across from the Aransas Pass. And then the one that I thought was kind of the sweetest was Port Aransas, which already had gone through 2 or 3 name changes by around 1910. And Port Aransas by this time had a small version of what all 4 towns wanted, and that was a port. And the Army had built in 1910 a smallish port called Harbor Island Basin. In lieu of spending more money and building a deep water port was what all 4 towns really wanted, because by this time there was a lot of farming going on in the plains, and the closest port that you could get if you wanted to send your crops to really make money was in Galveston, and Houston, which was beginning to build up its port, are way over in New Orleans. And nothing that you raised was going to last that long to get that far. So you needed a deep water port here in this area. And all four towns wanted it. The Harbor Island Basin was sort of a cheap compromise, but all of them wanted a deep water port. And each of them considered themselves eligible and kind of pushed the idea of each of them being a port city. This is a drawing of Corpus Christi in the 1880s, and you see it's on the bay. This is a sketch of Rockport, again, on the bay. The town of Aransas Pass was very blatant. You know, I'm a harbor town, this is big. And then, of course, there was Port Aransas. So one thing all four towns really wanted by the early 1910s was a deep water port. The one thing all four towns really feared in the 1910s was a hurricane. Rapidly driven, core-centered, spiraling bands of thunderstorms fueled by equatorial ocean heat merging with the humid air above it, then mixing with surface waves and upper air winds, they created a huge heat engine releasing energy equivalent to an atomic bomb exploding every 10 seconds. They demolished nests, they destroyed aviaries, they swept through sea lanes and cities and destroyed estuaries. They poured seawaters over coastlines and cities, flushing out fresh waters and salting rivers. They coursed over pastures and drowned cattle and horses. They flooded beaches, demolished mudflats, and pushed fish on shore too long to survive without oxygen. Hurricanes cut swaths through landforms and ripped new entries into bay. They recast nature, and they destroyed cities. And this is a picture of the morgue in Galveston right after the 1900 hurricane. All four towns feared hurricanes like crazy, and all four towns felt themselves secure and immune from ever getting hit by a hurricane. Port Aransas had its land and its dunes some 30 feet above high tide. This is quoting from a Port Aransas newspaper. Rockport, Aransas Pass, and Corpus Christi had the barrier islands themselves, nature's wall, one called it, to receive and break the force of the mighty water that runs ahead of the storm. All four towns touted their placement on the coast, a cup-like eddy on the left situated outside the hurricane belt. Consequently, despite the hurricane-rich 1880s, when 7 hurricanes affected South Texas from 1885 to 1888, and then 6 more hit in the early 1900s, there seemed little need for protection, much less the need to build an expensive seawall. Even a serious strike in 1916 fazed none of these towns. All considered that nature had been lavish with her gifts to this section. Until the late summer of 1919, when strong cycling winds burst out of the Caribbean, bore down on Havana, inundated Key West, and then spiraled ruthlessly in the Gulf, gathering even more energy and heat from its waters, that things began to change. From the moment those surge seas poured across the islands on Sunday, September 14th, then roared into land, it became evident that nature had not favored the coastal bend. People on Mustang Island fled to the hills, passing from dune to dune with the waves, eating into the sand. Harbor boats crashed against wharf pilings and heaved onto each other. Half-empty oil tanks overturned, their contents spilling out into already laden seas. Cotton bales joined lumber and planks, roaring westward with the waves. People of Aransas Pass awoke that morning to an oncoming flood. But it wasn't until the water went over the railroad tracks that they headed for high ground, escaping from wrecks of the first buildings already crashed on the shoreline. In Rockport, water was over the first road, the bay was rising and the wind a roar by the time people fled to the live oak groves, others to brushy areas on high ground. By the time the surge swept the bay into town, those who had stayed drowned in the very streets they had walked the day before. By the time the hurricane had cleared Corpus Christi, it had denuded North Beach of all but 3 buildings, swept a half block of structure, planks, logs, and oil from barrier islands onto the business district, and thrown the causeway's concrete girders more than 100 feet westward. But it was the death toll that staggered. Of the near 300 that had died that day, 11 were Rockport citizens, 7 were from Port Aransas, 5 from Aransas Pass, and the rest from Corpus Christi. But they came back, and in a sense you might say they learned a lesson. Aransas Pass started in late 1919 to build a protective barrier, which was completed around 1927 and composed basically of dredge materials. It's what we in Louisiana would have called a levee. The Corpus Christi Caller-Times did an article on it about 5 years ago, and I looked it up. I mean, I actually drove her there about a week and a half ago to find it, and I may have found part of it. And this is the part that I think possibly may have been part of this protective barrier. It's near Arch Street. Rockport's was completed in 1940, and I think it's the sweetest. It encompasses its fishbowl harbor and extends again in 2 different directions. Rockport was the easiest one to find because there is none. Both the documents that I consulted and people that I have talked with let me know that Port Aransas counts on its dunes. So that was, like I said, easy to find. Corpus Christi finally completed theirs in 1941. This was after at least 5 different starts. And what I think happened was that Corpus Christi did finally get the designation to be a deep water port, and I think they kind of went, okay, we're cool, we've got breakwaters. Until another hurricane hit in the 1930s and really destroyed a lot of downtown. So they finally started theirs in 1939, finishing it just before Pearl Harbor. So in the end, after all these years, while I was desperately seeking the seawall, I found several. But I also found madly, deeply, and incontrovertibly in love with the magnificence of the coastal bend. Thank you. Questions? 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 Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Was it a hard transition from moving from Louisiana to...
It was, like I said, especially at first. All right, I'm going to also admit that the fact that my mother-in-law here lived here was probably not a really good, selling point. But we went back. We had moved here in August. By November, we went back, Thanksgiving, be with my family and all. And I remember being in the backyard and looking up at the trees and thinking, I don't want to be here. And so actually, I guess it wasn't that hard at all after a few months. And she moved back to Louisiana later, so that was cool. Yes,
So when you go into Aransas Pass and go south, after you've gone over the bridge, there's a neighborhood that multiple houses are built. I mean, they look like they have basements and they are built into a huge levee. Is that part of that?
I think it is. And